up, YouTube? Welcome to Fred's Full Throttle. Each week I'm going to take you with me on my adventures in the world of cars. Let's get right into it. So for today's video, I'm going to be talking about why I picked the C7 Grand Sport over the Z06. There's a lot of little subtle things that might make you pick one versus the other. So I'm going to talk through why I picked the Grand Sport over the Z06. Alright, so let's get right into it. One of the things that comes up pretty frequently when people learn that I have a C7, or when I'm talking to my friends or other people on car forums, is like, wait a second, you got the Grand Sport. How come you picked that over a Stingray? Or more importantly, why didn't you get the Z06? Everybody's like, why not the Z06? That's obviously like the one to get. And it wasn't so clear cut for me. So real quick recap, for anybody who's not familiar, there are 4 types of C7 Corvette out there. Sub-variations within, but there's the Stingray / Z51, which is sort of the base model. It's the most popular one. There's the most of them out on the road. And that's got an LT1 V8, which produces 465 horsepower, which is a lot of power. The next model up is the Grand Sport, which usually comes out a couple years after the Z06 does, which we'll get into in a minute. But the Grand Sport is all the chassis and running gear of the Z06, probably with a couple little minor variations, but generally it's the same running gear. However, in this case, in the case of the C7, it doesn't have a supercharged motor. It's actually the same naturally aspirated LT1 motor that's in the regular Stingray. Then you have your Z06, which is the same running gear as the Grand Sport, again, probably with a couple little tweaks. And that actually has a supercharged motor. I forget the motor designation, but the motor in the C7 Z06 has a supercharger on it, and it's a slightly different motor, and that makes 650 horsepower as well as 650 pound-feet of torque. And then at the top is the ZR1, which I think it's 755 horsepower and some equally ridiculous number of torque. That's not what this video is about. So we're going to talk about why did I pick the Grand Sport over the Z06. Alright, so the first reason that I chose the Grand Sport over the Z06 is really, it came down to my concern about reliability and the ability of the car to deal with heat and heat management. The Z06 is a super fast car, but when you're running forced induction, you're running huge horsepower, high displacement, high fuel throughput, that motor generates a ton of heat. So as the Z06 came out, people started taking them to the track, which is what you do with a car like that. And quickly there seemed to be some posts on some internet forums, some members in various user clubs and groups saying that they had run into some issues with heat for their car on the track. And they had gotten what they called heat soak. And the concern there is that the car would basically get too hot, not get enough adequate cooling, and it would basically go into some sort of a limp mode and not be able to give you the full power output in order to protect the car. But also that's pretty frustrating if you're taking this car out on the track. It's designed as a performance car. It's advertised as something that can, you know, destroy every other car on the track. And to not be able to do that repeatedly for a long period of time was disappointing to a lot of people. Now, I don't have all the details about the heat soak. I don't know how prevalent it was, but I do know that there were some people that filed lawsuits. There was some talk of class action. And so that was coming out right around the time that I was starting to think about what car to get and that I wanted to get a Corvette. And that was pretty concerning to me. So I'm sure there are a lot of people that when they're buying a car like this, the money is no object. They throw down, you know, $100,000 and it's no big deal. For me, it was a little different. I saved for 6 years to buy this car. I actually made a video about that process right here, or here, or here. But I made a video about that process, and one of the things that I really wanted to be sure is that the car was going to be reliable. Certainly through the warranty period, you're going to be covered by a dealership if you have real problems. But more importantly, long term, you know, if you plan to own the car for a long time, which was sort of my plan, is are you going to run into problems? Are you going to constantly be buying parts? Are there going to be things that fail? And inevitably with any car, you're probably going to get little things. But I was concerned about, hey, if I decide to start doing some track stuff and I start learning how to really drive this car at its potential on the track, am I going to run into some of those problems? And I gotta say that knowing that there was that concern, even if it was like 1% of all car users, and those people were experts at the track and driving way harder and more skilled than I am, I was still pretty concerned that that was going to be something in the back of my mind to worry about. And for the amount of money that this was for me, that wasn't something I was willing to trade off. And so that was something that, it wasn't the sole decision on why I picked the Grand Sport over the Z06, but it was something that came to mind. And almost any Reddit thread, forum, Corvette owners group, if you poke around, you're gonna find people talking about heat soak. But that doesn't matter. For me, it was back of mind. Like, am I gonna be worrying about this? If I go to a track, am I gonna baby the car a little bit more or be more careful because I'm worried about overheating the engine? So I didn't want to deal with that. So the next thing on my list is looks. Now, the Z06 looks fantastic. Excellent car. Every time I see one in person, I think the Z06 looks awesome. But for me, there's a couple little styling cues I like better about the Grand Sport than I do the Z06. The first one is that I like that this has red taillights versus the clear ones in a Z06. There's nothing wrong with clear taillights. They look really good, but I like the red a little bit better. And especially this thing is Admiral Blue Metallic. I've got red brake calipers, and having the red brake lights, it just gives this little accent. Plus the Grand Sport logo itself actually has a red part of the logo. And I think that having that blue and red kind of offset really looks good. And then the other big thing for me cosmetically that I like better about the Grand Sport than the Z06 is I like how low the hood is. The Grand Sport has no supercharger, so there's nothing that has to sit on top of the engine in order to fit under the hood. The Z06 has a supercharger, which adds, I think it's about 2 inches to the overall height of the engine. And so for that, they actually have a slightly higher hood on the Z06. Now, you could argue that that gives you a little bit more of like an elevation change on the hood, but for me, I actually prefer the low and sleek look. It makes the car look a little leaner. Certainly that's a personal choice, a personal preference, but that's one thing that I like. So the next thing for me was the overall balance of the car. And let me explain a little bit about what I mean. A whole bunch of different magazines and car publications did reviews of both cars. They did back-to-back, they did separately, they did on-road driving, they did track. And if you go and watch any of the videos or you read any of the articles back when the Grand Sport was the new car, everyone was trying to compare the two, the Z06 versus the Grand Sport. And one of the things that kept coming out was that the Grand Sport was the best balanced car, that the amount of power was just about perfect for the chassis. And what it meant was that you weren't able to easily overdrive the car. The car, had the right amount of power that you could be pretty hard on the throttle, and the chassis could handle it. It could keep things under control, and you really could drive this thing at 9/10, 10/10 on the track pretty easily as somebody who does track days and really get the most out of the car. The Z06, on the other hand, was a little bit different. A lot of people and a lot of journalists said that the Z06 is a little bit overdriven, overpowered for the chassis. Now, certainly that's up for debate. I'm not going to argue the point, but for me, after watching probably every video on YouTube about the Grand Sport versus the Z06, watching all the reviews of the Grand Sport as well as the Z06, it did sound like the Z06 is one of those things that if you're an expert driver and you have a lot of skill behind the wheel, you can certainly eke out a lot better performance from the Z06 versus the Grand Sport. But the Grand Sport isn't trying to kill you at every turn. And the Z06, it sounds like, at high speed, if you mash on the throttle and aren't really paying attention or aren't, fully engaged, that thing can spin out and the back end will lead the way off of a corner into the walls, barriers, a ditch on the road, whatever. And there are certainly a lot of videos of people with Z06s spinning out and going off the road just from putting the power down. And so that was something in the back of my mind. And so that was kind of an important thing for me, is that I wanted a car that I could drive hard but not completely be overwhelmed by it, especially as I'm somebody who's kind of learning the car side of things and figuring out how to drive high performance. That was actually a pretty big consideration and something that I thought quite a bit about. So I thought that was an interesting observation. And it's not just me saying this. There are a whole bunch of reviews out there and videos that talk about exactly this, that the Grand Sport is the sweet spot for the C7 overall for driving engagement, for track use, all of that stuff. All right, so the next consideration for me that came into deciding between the two cars was is the Grand Sport enough fun and performance for me while not spending kind of that extra dollar for the Z06? But for me, it was like, well, what's the best trade-off between kind of the money and the fun and the performance? And so I thought, well, I'll start with a lower car, and if that doesn't thrill me or if that's not exciting enough, then I can try out something a little higher up the range. And so the Grand Sport, I thought, that sounds like the right balance for me. And so coming from the perspective where I haven't owned a sports car before, that seemed like a pretty reasonable thing. Seek alternate route. What? So when I was buying, I decided to go and rent one for 4 hours, specifically the Grand Sport. It was actually the automatic instead of the manual, but I figured that would give me a lot better sense than just a test drive. So I rented one, I drove it for the full 4 hours, I made the absolute most of it, returning it with like 5 minutes left on the clock, and that was like the selling point. That was the game changer for me. I'd test driven a number of other cars, including an M2, Camaro SS, some other stuff, Cayman S. And so for driving this for 4 hours, that was really what sold me. I was blown away by the performance that this thing offers, how fast it is, how smooth it is, how good it looks, all of that. And that to me right away was like, okay, I don't need to spend additional money to get something else if this is going to be that good. And that was actually a pretty good realization, that because it saved me a bunch of money, and I realized that I could be just as happy with this thing and spend a significant amount less than that. That guy crossing the street, his license plate was now or never, and he was going and grabbing some free stuff that was on the side of the road, and so I guess he lived up to that. So the last reason I decided not to get the Z06 and instead go with the Grand Sport came down to money. I did a video about how I afforded this car as just a normal person working a normal job, and that video talks about all of the finance side as far as how much money I put down, all the details about what the car cost. And so if you watch that, I certainly could have afforded to buy the Z06, but given that last point where the balance between how much fun could I get in the Grand Sport and what was the price difference, that was kind of the deciding factor for me, is that I could get enough fun, which honestly, like, I could get so much fun out of this thing without having to spend that extra money. Now you might be wondering, how much is that extra money? And the difference for me at the time, in 2017, buying new was about $15,000. Take any model, you know, convertible or a coupe, manual or automatic, whatever the package, 2LT, 3LT, and take that version and basically add about 15,000 onto it. And so for me, it was like, do I want an extra 200 horsepower for $15,000? And ultimately, after driving this thing, renting one and driving it for 4 hours, the answer was no. It wasn't worth the additional money for how good this car already is. For the performance, for the looks, for the balance, for the feel on the track, all that stuff, there just wasn't that value proposition for me. Now that may sound a little like pedantic to be micro-mincing and deciding, you know, all the little finer things, but it really came down to me that I wasn't gonna be able to buy multiple awesome supercars, you know, all the time. And so that was kind of the final kind of deciding factors, that when I took all those other things into consideration, put them all together, it really kind of steered me in which direction I wanted to go. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching, and until next time, Fred out.